Well, good afternoon, and welcome to our next episode in our study on the images of God in the book of Psalms. So today, I'm going to introduce an image that isn't used as a metaphor in the book of Psalms like the other studies we've done. The other studies say, "The Lord is my," and then we fill that in with rock or stronghold or portion. Today's image is going to be the image of the Lord as a vine dresser. And it's never used in a statement like the others were in a direct statement. The Lord is my vine dresser, for instance. It doesn't say that. However, whenever the nation of Israel is used in the Old Testament and pictured as or in the image of a vineyard, we see that the Lord is the vine dresser of that vineyard. And so we'll see that in a few minutes, some of the verses we look at. There's actually only one psalm reference to the Lord as a vine dresser, and that's in Psalm 80, and we'll look at that. But we'll also look at the other passages used in the prophets primarily that picture Israel as a vineyard and the Lord as its vine dresser. So let's start by looking at a couple of passages that make similar statements, and I'm actually going to start with one from the New Testament in John 15. So let me change to my Bible here, and we'll look at that. So in John 15, we have Jesus saying, "I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser." Now that's the most direct statement of identifying the Lord as a vine dresser. And it's found in the book of John, spoken by Jesus. And later on in our study, we'll look at John 15. Psalm 80 this is a portion of the psalm that we'll look at a little bit later. Psalm 80, verses 8 and 9. "You removed a vine from Egypt. You drove out the nations and planted it. You cleared the ground before it, and it took deep root and filled the land." So in that psalm, you can see the imagery there of the Lord removing a vine from Egypt. And of course, that's referring to the exodus of the people of Israel from Egypt. Driving out the nations and planting it, and that would be referring to the driving out of the Canaanites out of the land of Canaan, which was the inheritance of the children of Israel. And, and then in Isaiah chapter 5, I'll look at this too. "For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah are his delightful plant. Thus he looked for justice, but behold, bloodshed. For righteousness, but behold, a cry of distress." So here's three verses, or three passages here in the Old Testament and one in the New Testament that talk about the Lord as our vine dresser. So a little background here about this image in the Old Testament. As I said, there's no explicit statement in the Old Testament anyway that identifies the Lord as a vine dresser through a direct metaphor. However, it is, as I say, I'm using it from the context of where Israel is described as a vineyard. Isaiah has two portions relating Israel to the vineyard of the Lord. Jeremiah has one, and there's three passages in Ezekiel that identify the Lord as the vine dresser or the husbandman of the vineyard. And then I believe there's also a reference in Hosea. So all of our references, except for the Psalm reference, are from the prophets. Now, the background to my screen here is actually a picture of some of the terraces in Israel on which vineyards are planted and grown. And I'll refer back to this background as we go through our passage here, our study here. The picture is actually taken from a book called Historical Photos of the Holy Land, and these are photos that are taken from the late 1800s and the early 1900s. And the value of this particular book is that these photos, not a lot has changed from the times of Old Testament Israel to today at least up until the early 1900s, a lot of the agriculture and the viticulture was really didn't change very much. So we'll see some of these images in the book of or in the Old Testament will be actually illustrated by this picture behind me. So there's no plant in the Bible that's mentioned more often than the vineyard or the vine, and there's no fruit mentioned more often than the grape, and the grape products, which primarily would refer to wine or raisins. Jesus made reference to vineyards and grapes and wine quite often in his parables in the Old Testament or in the New Testament. The parables that Jesus used, in fact, all the parables in the Bible, whether they're Old Testament or New Testament, the parables are actually taken from the everyday life of the people. And so since viticulture and the growing of grapes and planting vineyards was such a common occupation in ancient Israel, Jesus referred to it quite often, as did the Apostle John in the book of Revelation. He's going to make reference to the imagery of the vineyard as well in his book. All of the vineyard imagery in the Old Testament that relates Israel to the vineyard of the Lord of hosts, all of those images are in the context of judgment, with the exception of one. So the different imagery that we'll look at, the different verses that we'll look at, where Israel is pictured as the vineyard of the Lord, those passages are going to be in the context of judgment. Let's see. Viticulture was one of the most common agricultural pursuits in the Old Testament. One of the reasons for that is the topography and the climate of ancient Israel was very suitable for that kind of thing. Vines don't require a lot of water, and they can grow in fairly stony soil, and that describes a lot of the topography of Israel, especially before modern times. So if you remember, when the spies were sent into the Promised Land back in the book of Numbers, the first thing that they came back with and told the people about was the size of the grapes or the vines or the clusters. And I'll read that passage out of Numbers. It's in Numbers 13:23. It says, "Then they came to the valley of Eshcol, and from there cut down a branch with a single cluster of grapes. And they carried it on a pole between two men with some pomegranates and figs." So one of the things that impressed the spies as they entered into the land of Canaan, spied out the land of Canaan, is that the land of Canaan was already very productive in terms of its viticulture and its vineyards and its grapes. The way grapes were planted and grown can be actually illustrated from a passage in Isaiah chapter 5. And so I'd like to maybe move to that right now. Isaiah chapter 5. And what that's going to show us is kind of how a vineyard was planted and cared for by the vine dresser. So I think I'll put it all on screen here. So let me read this. "Let me sing now for my beloved, a song of my beloved concerning his vineyard. My beloved had a vineyard on a fertile hill. He dug it all around, removed its stones, and planted it with the choicest vine. He built a tower in the middle of it, and he hewed out a wine vat in it. Then he expected it to produce good grapes, but it produced only worthless ones. And now, O inhabitants of Jerusalem and men of Judah, you judge between me and my vineyard. What more was there to do for my vineyard that I have not done in it? Why, when I expected it to produce good grapes, did it produce worthless ones? So now, let me tell you what I'm going to do to my vineyard. I will remove its hedge, and it will be consumed. I will break down its wall, and it will become trampled down. I will lay it waste, and it will not be pruned or hoed, but briars and thorns will come up. I will charge the clouds to rain no rain on it. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah are his delightful plant. Thus he looked for justice, but behold bloodshed, for righteousness, but behold a cry of distress. So in this passage here, we actually have kind of a description of what was involved in preparing the ground for a vineyard and for vines that would grow fruitful grapes. And so just in this Isaiah 5, I'll just refer back to this. The first thing a farmer would do is to find a fertile hillside on which to plant the vines. And we see that in 5:1. My beloved had a vineyard on a fertile hill. And since the land of Israel was extremely rocky, the next thing in preparing the ground, the land had to be cleared of much of the surface stones as well as the larger stones that would be under the earth, and that's referred to in verse 2. He dug it all around and removed its stones. The third thing we see in verse 2, he planted it with the choicest vines. So the best vines would be chosen because they would produce the best fruit, and it was the responsibility of the vine dresser to choose the vines to be planted. Now in this Isaiah passage, just if you haven't recognized it, the Lord is the one speaking this. He is the vine dresser, and he is the one describing this. The other thing that is in this passage here is a lot of times the vine dresser would build a tower, what's called a tower, a migdol, in the middle of the vineyard to protect the vineyard. And the tower was usually built of stones from the surrounding area, and it usually had a spiral staircase around the outside of the tower, and the tower would often provide shelter for the farmer and his family during the harvest time. And between the harvest seasons, the tower was also, or often, a place where a watchman stayed to overlook the vineyard. The vineyard was further protected by a stone wall that was built around its perimeter, and the wall was often covered on top with a thick hedge. And so Isaiah 5:2 talks about the Lord building a tower. He hewed out a wine vat. A lot of the larger vineyards had their own wine vats where the grapes were crushed and the wine was collected. And references to the hedge and the wall are in Isaiah 5:5. I will remove its hedge, it will be consumed. I will break down its wall, and it will be trampled down. And so in this picture in the background here, I'll just kind of point to it. So you've got the vineyards here. You can tell the soil is pretty rocky in here. But you can see here's the walls. There's walls here, walls here. You can't see it very well. Maybe I might have to move my head. That right there's the tower. Okay, that would be considered one of the watchtowers. There's another one here. Let me see. I might actually have. Let me pause right here for a minute and bring up a couple more pictures. So what I want to show you, I've got some of these early photos from Israel relating some pictures of some of the vineyards. And so let me load this up here. Okay. Now this is simply a picture of a farmer tending some of the vines there. You can see there's your wall in the background there. So the wall, the vines of the vineyards were on terraced hillsides, and those walls were used to protect the vineyard. Let's see what else I got here. This is the picture we've been looking at. This is again, you've got your hillsides with actually olive trees and then vineyards along the walls here. Okay, here's an example of the watchtowers that are being spoken of. You see it here, they're part of the wall. You got some steps going up there. This is a place where a watchman would overlook the vineyards and the orchards. And so that's what the Bible is talking about when it talks about a tower. There's another one. Okay, so again, just look at the hillside here. Lots of, these are vineyards here, vines, and another tower. Looks like it's got some brush on. This is probably for shade, I suppose. It had to be pretty hot out there. But notice again, it's built out of the same rocks that the wall's built out of. Another tower with a family. And there, you can see the grapes in her hand here, being picked. There, some guy's posing with a cluster of grapes. Pretty good sized grapes, too. That's a wine press. That's an ancient wine press. And so the grapes would go in here, they'd be trampled here, apparently. I'm not exactly sure, but and then they would be poured into jars for keeping. Okay, so those are just some early photos of what a vineyard would look like in that period of time. So let me go back here. Okay, there we are. And so that's kind of what the passage there in Isaiah is talking about. Now, in the Old Testament, there were certain laws that were written with relationship to vines and vineyards. In Leviticus 19:10, it says that the gleanings of the vineyard after the harvest were to be left on the vines so that the widows, the orphans, and the poor could go in and they could glean the fields. So the vineyards, the vine dresser and the owner of the vineyard was expected to leave the gleanings after the harvest for those that didn't own property in Israel. In Numbers chapter 6, if an individual took the vow of a Nazirite, he was not allowed to partake of any product related to the grape. They couldn't have wine, couldn't eat grapes, no raisins. And then in Deuteronomy 23, the law allowed an individual to pick and eat grapes from another's vineyard as long as he didn't collect them into a vessel. In other words, if you're traveling and along the road you come by one of your neighbor's vineyards, you would be able to reach out and pick and eat some grapes on your way, but you couldn't collect any of them to take home or to keep for yourself. So those were some of the laws in the period of Israel that related to grapes. Another thing about grapes and vineyards is this. The Lord said one of the curses for disobedience would be that their vineyards would be unfruitful. And these passages in the Old Testament that we're going to read about, they're all in the context of judgment, reminding Israel that the Lord promised, first of all, if they obeyed, their vineyards would be productive. If they disobeyed, their vineyards wouldn't produce fruit. And so the loss of fruit and productivity among the vineyards was one of the disciplines that the Lord brought in to the people of Israel. And of course, that would be a pretty painful thing because the raising of grapes in vineyards was such a prominent part of the occupation of the families of Israel. Okay, that's probably enough of the background of vineyards and vines in ancient Israel. I want to just remind us as we go through these images, the images of the Lord in the Old Testament and the New Testament are intended to tell us something about the Lord, about what He's like. And so in the imagery of the vine dresser and the vineyard, we'll see the particular aspect or attribute of the Lord that's being emphasized. Okay, let's begin by looking at Jeremiah 2:21, and we'll begin to look at these images in the Old Testament. Jeremiah 2:21, the Lord speaking, yet I planted you a choice vine, a completely faithful seed. How then have you turned yourself before me into the degenerate shoots of a foreign vine? And so we have in that particular passage there the idea of the Lord planting the nation of Israel in the land, and as a choice vine and a completely faithful seed. So like we said before, the vine dresser's responsibility was to produce the best fruits from the grape, and they did it by choosing the best vines. And the Lord, however, instead, the nation of Israel, as it's repeated here, turned into the degenerate shoots of a foreign vine. Another passage to look at is that Isaiah 5 passage that we saw earlier. And in the Isaiah 5 passage, it's a similar picture. Again, this is a picture of the Lord's judgment or discipline upon Israel, because as the vineyard of the Lord of hosts, they did not produce good fruit, but instead bad fruit, in spite of all that the Lord had done and provided for them. And this is actually what the image of the Lord as the vine dresser really focuses on and emphasizes. What it really says about the Lord is that He has carefully provided everything that we need in order to produce the spiritual fruit that He wants from our lives. And the image of the vine dresser in both Old and New Testament, the key element is this: the care and the concern and the nurturing that the vine dresser does for the vines in order that the right kind of fruit can be produced. So what we see happening in Isaiah is the Lord's preparation of the land, planting of the seed and the vine there in verses 1 and 2. And at the end of verse 2 it says, He expected it to produce good grapes, but it produced only worthless ones. So in spite of all that the vine dresser did in planting the vineyard on a fertile hill, taking out the stones, building a tower, He expected it to produce good grapes, and it didn't. And so what's the vine dresser going to do? Well, that's starting in verse 3. And now, inhabitants of Jerusalem and men of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. So again, my vineyard indicates that this is the Lord's vineyard. He's the vine dresser. What more was there to do for my vineyard that I have not done in it? And again, that's the focus of the vine dresser imagery, is that the Lord has done all that was necessary in order for a productive crop to be produced. A crop of spiritual fruit is what we're talking about here. And the Lord gives this rhetorical question in verse 4, why, when I expected it to produce good grapes, did it produce worthless ones? And that question's never answered. It just moves right into now what the Lord is going to do to His vineyard, because it did not produce the kind of fruit it was supposed to. In verse 5, so now let me tell you what I'm going to do to my vineyard. I will remove its hedge, and it will be consumed. I will break down its wall. It will become trampled ground. I will lay it waste. It won't be pruned or hoed. Briars and thorns will come up, and I'm going to command the clouds not to rain any rain on it. All of that is imagery of judgment, and it's going to be referring to the captivity of the Assyrians, and later will be also applied to the Babylonians. But then in verse 7, we have the concluding statement. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah are His delightful plant. Thus He looked for justice, but behold bloodshed. He looked for righteousness, but behold a cry of distress. When the vine dresser planted the vineyard, provided everything that was needed to produce good fruit, and instead they produced bad fruit. What was the fruit that was expected? Righteousness in verse 7, and justice, those two elements of Israel's spiritual fruit. But instead of justice, he got bloodshed. Instead of righteousness, he got a cry of distress. Now in Hebrew, there's a little word play on those pairs of words there that we won't go into, but the word for justice and the word for bloodshed sound very similar, as well as the word for righteousness and the word for a cry of distress. So Isaiah 5, Israel is the vineyard of the Lord of hosts. The Lord is the vine dresser. And the Lord is now going to break down the wall, remove the hedge. He's not going to tend it any longer. He's not going to provide rain for it. And the idea is, the whole point of planting a vineyard is so that it will produce good fruit. And if it's not producing good fruit, it's really not good for anything else. And so you don't spend any more time with it. The next passage is in Isaiah 27, 2 through 6. This is the only place in the Old Testament where the imagery of the vineyard is positive. And Isaiah is speaking about the restoration of Israel in the last days. But I want you to see the description that Isaiah gives of the vine dresser here in this passage. In that day, a vineyard of wine, sing of it. I, the Lord, am its keeper. Okay, there's our vineyard right there. Our vine dresser, I mean. I, the Lord, am its keeper. I water it every moment so that no one will damage it. I guard it night and day. I have no wrath. Should someone give me briars and thorns in battle, I would step on them. I would burn them completely. Oh, let him rely on my protection. Let him make peace with me. Let him make peace with me. In the days to come, Jacob will take root. Israel will blossom and sprout, and they will fill the whole world with fruit. And so this passage here talks about the Lord actually destroying the enemies of Israel and producing a great blessing upon the entire world through Israel as the vineyard of the Lord of hosts. There's another passage that we won't turn to. It's Ezekiel 15, which is a parable. What Ezekiel 15 says, it's another parable of judgment, but basically it says this: what good is the wood of the vine, the grapevine? What good is it? The point is, if the vine doesn't produce good fruit, it's really not good for anything else. It's not useful for anything else. The wood isn't strong enough to build anything with. It's not even strong enough to hang something on. It's really only good, and it's not even good for that. You can throw it in the fire and it'll burn, but it won't burn very long. It'll burn up very fast. And the point of the passage in Ezekiel 15 is, as the vineyard of the Lord, if the vineyard isn't producing good fruit, it's really not good for anything else. The whole point of a vineyard is to produce grapes. Now I want to turn to the one passage that is in the book of Psalms where, let's see, I don't even have it on here. Well, that's interesting. So the one passage in the book of Psalms we're going to look at is Psalm 80, verse 8 through 16. So let's go there, and I'll switch my camera to Psalm 80, 8 through 16. Okay. Psalm 80, 8 through 16. And what you want to look at here again is, what is this psalm saying about the Lord? This is the only example of this imagery where the Lord is the vine dresser used in the book of Psalms. And like the other examples of the vine dresser motif, the Lord's here pictured as the one who has cared for and nurtured Israel the vine. And in this particular psalm, this is what they call a psalm of lament. The psalmist is asking the Lord to restore them to the place of blessing that they once had. And he's using the imagery of a vineyard. So let's read it. You removed a vine from Egypt. You drove out the nations and planted it. You cleared the ground before it, and it took deep root and filled the land. The mountains were covered with its shadow, and the cedars of God with its boughs. It was sending out its branches to the sea, and its shoots to the river. Why have you broken down its hedges, so that all who pass by that way pick its fruit? A boar in the forest eats it away, and whatever moves in the field feeds on it. O God of hosts, turn now again, we beseech you. Look down from heaven and see. Take care of this vine, even the shoot which your right hand has planted, and the son on whom you've strengthened for yourself. It's burned with fire, it's cut down. They perish at the rebuke of your countenance. So in these passages here, the verses 12 and 13 describe the condition of the vineyard. The hedges are broken down. It's not protected from people who pass by and pick its fruit, and wild animals come in and eat it away. And so the psalmist down in verse 14 pleads to the Lord to turn again and to begin to care for the vine. So this is another example where the Lord, as the vine dresser of Israel, has provided them with all the blessing that they need in order to produce spiritual fruit. And in the beginning, they prospered. They were greatly blessed. And then they turned away from the Lord, and so the Lord rejected his vineyard. So the conclusion that we might give for this is actually a good place to go is going to be in the New Testament, that passage that Jesus used in John 15 of the vine dresser and the vine. So let's go there for just a moment. So we're in John chapter 15, and the image of the vine and the vine dresser is carried over in the New Testament in this image, or in this passage right here as well. Every time the image of a vine dresser is used of the Lord, he's pictured as doing everything necessary for the growth and fruitfulness of his people. So in John 15, Jesus comes and he says this, I am the true vine. All right, so he's contrasting himself with the nation of Israel. I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. And then it talks about all that the Lord does in order to produce fruit from the branches. And the point of John 15, Jesus speaks this to his disciples, is that the whole point of a vine and the branches of a vine is that they produce fruit. And in this John 15, you see I've highlighted the words there, the word for fruit, which is used throughout the passage there. And then I'm going to highlight for you the other key word in this passage here. And it's the word abide. Okay? I am the true vine. My Father is the vine dresser. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes it away. See, that's what the vine dresser does. And every branch that bears fruit, he prunes it. So again, these references to he are references to the Lord's Father, or God the Father. Speaking to his disciples, you are already clean because of the word I've spoken to you. Abide in me, and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit of itself unless it abides in the vine, so neither can you unless you abide in me. So the fruit comes from the branches. The branches have to be connected to the vine. And the vine dresser, the Father, is the one that makes sure that the vine has all that is needed in order for those branches to bear fruit. I am the vine, you are the branches. He who abides in me and I in him, he bears much fruit. For apart from me you can do nothing. If anyone does not abide in me, he's thrown away as a branch and dries up. They gather them and cast them into the fire, and they're burned. That's all branches are good for if they're not bearing fruit. And if you abide in me, and my words abide in you, ask whatever you wish, it will be done for you. My Father is glorified by this, that you bear much fruit, and so prove to be my disciples. The proof of discipleship in John 15 is that you bear fruit. And the kind of fruit that we're talking about is the fruit that is produced by the branches through abiding in the vine, the Lord Jesus. And it reminds me of a passage in 2 Peter, and let me see if I can find that for you. In 2 Peter, I think it's 1:3 or 1:4, it says that God has provided for us everything that we need for life and godliness. And that essentially sums up what's behind the image of the Lord as a vine dresser. The Lord has provided for us everything that we need to live a life of godliness. And He's done it through the provision of His Word, and He's done it through the provision of His Spirit. But unless we are abiding in the vine, unless we're connected to the vine, we will never bear spiritual fruit. The true disciples of Jesus Christ are those who are resting in the vine, abiding in the vine, and the Lord produces through them the spiritual fruit that we see in Galatians 5, which is the fruit of the Holy Spirit. So let's be grateful today that in spite of all of what's going on around us, we still have the confidence that we lack nothing that we need in order to continue to grow in our walk with the Lord Jesus Christ and produce fruit that brings glory to the Father. So even though we can't meet together on Sunday mornings on a regular basis like we have in the past, that in no way should detract us from the fact that we are still provided with everything we need to live the kind of life that God wants us to live. He has provided everything we need in order to do that, whether we're together or whether we're apart. So let's be grateful to the Lord, and let's be thankful that as we await the time we can gather together, we still have all that we need in the Word and through the Spirit to continue to live lives that grow deep in faith and produce spiritual fruit to the glory of the Lord Jesus Christ. And so with that, I'll close, and we will see you on Sunday, where we talk about the Lord as our intercessor.